This morning, and we have Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. Good morning, Dr. John.
Yeah, good morning, Mick.
It's great to have you back again, Dr. John. So many weeks in a row that you haven't been able to get away and talk to people somewhere else in the world, which is pretty exciting for us.
Yeah, well, exciting for me too, but we're all restricted to Australia for the moment. And
yes, and
maybe for quite a while yet.
Yes, so it seems. Now, Dr. John, last week you were talking to us a little bit about blood groups. It was one of the questions that came in from a listener out there. By the way, if you have any questions, please send them through to our text line. Just SMS them to 0401 949 949. And of course, we answer questions that come from all of you, our listeners here on the coast. And of course, we talk a little bit about news. Now, Dr. John, can we mix two of them together right now? The question from the listener in regards to blood groups, and we were just hearing on the news this morning about a brand new. I guess it's not really it's not going to save the human race, but a lot of people might get these injections, and they're looking forward to something that will stop them getting coronavirus. How's all this stuff going to work?
Yeah, look, it's interesting, Mick, and like you mentioned, it's great that. The topical news, like this announcement of another potential vaccine, how it does tie in with the sort of things that we talk about. And you mentioned the ABO blood groups, because we got that question that we addressed last week from the listener, saying, how come we've got 8 different blood groups, and we only started with 2 people? So how do you explain that? And so we discussed how we actually got to the 8 different blood groups. But look, it's worth exploring that a little bit further, because it does give people a bit of understanding of how some of these vaccines are going to work. So I thought it was worth having a look at it again this morning. And the way the blood groups were actually discovered, I suppose you've got to go back 100 to 150 years ago, when physicians who were treating people with blood loss felt that it might be handy to give them some blood. This is in the days, of course, before regular blood transfusions, which we have now. And so they tried that, and sometimes it worked fantastically, really did help the people. And so they were very encouraged to continue and use it a bit more. And then suddenly they experienced some terrible reactions, and people actually died. And it was only in the early 1900s that a bloke called Landsteiner discovered the blood groups, and a little bit later on how they discovered what the problem was. And it turns out that if you inject a foreign protein into a person, or get it into their system somehow, they produce their own antibody proteins against that foreign protein, because that's part of our immune system. And the problem with the blood groups is that on the surface of the red blood cells there are these proteins, and we all have them, but some of us have different ones. And people with type A blood have a slightly different protein to people with type B blood. So if you give type B blood to a type A person, they produce antibodies against it, and that makes them very, very ill. And type O people don't have either protein, but type AB people have both. So the ABs, are quite happy with anything that they get, sort of, because they recognise it as part of them.
So it all works.
So and so that's how it works. So the problem is the proteins on the red blood cells. Now the Rh system, the positive and negative system, is similar, but it is a little bit different in the way it works. And it used to be a problem mainly in pregnancy and childbirth, because if a father is Rh positive and a mother is Rh negative, then her baby is going to be positive, because the positive gene is dominant over the negative one. And in some cases...
what's RH?
It stands for rhesus. It was discovered in rhesus monkeys or something like that. And I don't... It's not particularly relevant these days, but the name is stuck.
Uh-huh.
So if you just think of positive and negative and don't worry too much about the RH,
Okay, yeah.
you're okay. But in the process of childbirth, occasionally some of the baby's blood gets into the mother's system.
Mm-hmm.
And she then starts to produce antibodies against it.
Oh, wow.
Right, which don't affect her at the time. In fact, they don't affect her at all, and they don't affect that baby because that baby's already been born and he's out of here, you know. So there's no problem there. But when she has another pregnancy, when she's got a positive baby, then sometimes some of her antibodies get across the placenta and start attacking that baby's blood.
Wow.
And it used to be a really serious problem before the days of exchange transfusions, and it got worse with every pregnancy. But now a woman who is negative gets an injection at childbirth to try and mop up any of the baby's blood that might have potentially got across into her system.
Wow.
So it's not really a problem now.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the basis of the whole issue, that if you get foreign proteins into your system, then you start producing antibodies against them. Right? And of course, this is the basis of vaccination. If we think about the original vaccines, like the smallpox vaccine, you were given an infection with a smallpox virus that had been rendered fairly harmless. So you produced antibodies against the protein of that virus, and if you then came in contact with the original virus, then your immune system was all charged up and ready to go against it.
Wow.
Right? And it's been the same with quite a number of viruses. But the interesting thing is that they were not able to find any way of introducing coronaviruses into people that cause that sort of immune reaction. So up until very, very recently, there have been no vaccines against any coronaviruses.
Right.
Yeah, but this is why the modern research is going in a slightly different direction, and we're going to have a talk about that.
Ooh, that sounds exciting. It is 18 minutes past 8. You're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. And when it comes to vaccines, he does know a lot about it. He was a chief medical officer in the Royal Australian Navy. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, Mick. I was in the Navy for 20 years.
So he knows a fair bit about needles and blood and stuff that I hate. 2 minutes past 8. And we have Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International, talking to us this morning a bit about blood groups and the vaccines, particularly vaccines for coronavirus. Now, Dr. John, I'm particularly interested in why, firstly, is it so hard to get a vaccine for coronavirus? And we've heard about two different ones potentially coming up. I was chatting to a few mates just last night. We were arguing, admittedly. I was talking to one of my mates who's had open heart surgery, and he is keen as mustard to get the vaccine. And I said, well, I'm going to wait a few years and see if you grow 3 heads, and if you don't, well, maybe I'd consider it then. I'm a little concerned about the vaccines. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, look, there is reason to have a little bit of concern, because it's new technology that's never really been tried before. And it seems, from what I understand, that one of the problems with coronaviruses, and they're just a particular group of viruses that includes the common cold virus, that's a coronavirus, not the influenza virus, that's different.
Does that mean these vaccines that they're bringing out might stop us getting the common cold?
No, not necessarily, because it's a different coronavirus, but it's in the coronavirus family. Anyway, one of the reasons apparently why we've never had a common cold vaccine either, one of the reasons is that apparently your body doesn't sort of let the virus in quite as easily as some of the other viruses, and it gets in through your respiratory tract, which your body sees as an external surface. Anyway, for that reason, I think it's been very, very difficult in the past for any effective vaccines against coronaviruses.
Yeah.
So the modern world has decided that they're going to have to take a slightly different tack.
Mm-hmm.
And what they've tried to do, and I think this is the basis of the Oxford vaccine that we've heard about,
Yep.
to get some of the viral protein into you and see if you then can produce antibodies against that protein, so that if you then come in contact with the virus, your immune system will be charged up and ready to combat it.
Mm-hmm.
But these two that have been announced in the last week are a little bit different. The first one was the Pfizer vaccine, which they said was 90% effective.
Mm-hmm.
And this latest one, the Moderna vaccine, which is now said to be 94% effective.
Yeah.
But they use an even more tricky technology.
Mm-hmm.
What they've done is they've taken some of the the viral genetics, the viral RNA,
Mm-hmm.
and they're trying to get that into your system so that you actually produce, they use your body to produce some of the viral proteins, right? They don't actually put the protein into you, they put the RNA into you so that you produce the viral protein.
Why would we want to do that?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, because you then might produce antibodies against that viral protein that you have produced yourself, right? And then you will hopefully have immunity later on if you come in contact with the virus. Now, this is a technology that has never been tried before. It's absolutely new.
Before we go any further, you say one of them is 90% effective. What does that mean for the other 10%? Does that mean that horrible things happen, or it just doesn't work?
Just isn't effective.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think what they discovered was that the number of people who had the placebo, that is, didn't actually get the real vaccine,
Yep.
There was a 90% difference between the ones who caught the virus. I think that's it anyway. You know,
Okay.
so, and but the Moderna vaccine was a little bit more effective than that.
Yes.
But look, it's a very, very tricky sort of technology, and with developments of vaccines, they often take 5-10 years, you know, or more, whereas this is being done in great haste.
Yep.
And part of the problem that I see is the money that's involved. Because this often clouds the issue. And I did read a report that when that Pfizer vaccine was announced a week or so ago, the share price went up by about 6% overnight. And I did read that the CEO offloaded a few shares and pocketed
I saw that myself.
5 million, you see. And I think last night the Dow hit a record 30,000. Never hit that before. So, you know, if the share price then comes down, but people have offloaded a few shares, you know, it makes you wonder. And when there's so much money and fame involved as there is at the present time, it's very tempting for people to rush things.
Yes.
And I think might be a bit of indecent haste with some of these vaccines.
Absolutely. Now, with the vaccine, you say, like, you know, there's 10% that doesn't necessarily work and the other 90% is doing its job. One of the issues that I've heard, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that what we haven't seen, and the reason why they often take a long time, is what are the side effects that can happen 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the track from having the vaccine?
Yes. Well, look, this is one of the reasons why it hasn't been successful before, because they did try to produce a vaccine with the earlier SARS virus that came around about 10 or 15 years ago, and it seemed that some of the trial vaccines, when the animals that they tried them on were exposed to the virus, they got sicker than they might have got if they hadn't had the vaccine. So, so this is why it's a very, very new field, and where extreme caution is required.
Well, And he answers your questions that you send through to our text line. That's 0401 949 949. If you have a burning question, of course you can go to the creation.com website. They've got thousands of pages with tens of thousands of answers to questions. But Dr. John would love to answer them online or on air here, because a lot of people have the same question that you might have. And we did have a question that came in last week, Dr. John. And the question was, curious what Dr. John's thoughts are on the origin of giants in the Bible and the linkage to the appearance of demons in the earth, i.e. spirits of dead giants. Interesting question.
Interesting question, Mick, and one of the most difficult ones really to answer, because the Bible isn't very specific about it. But it's an intriguing question, because a lot of people have wondered. There's an interesting passage in the book of Genesis about the sons of God who seem to have cohabited with human women and produced this race of people called the Nephilim, which is sometimes translated as giants.
Yeah.
And the question has been, who were these sons of God? And some people, because the Bible doesn't tell you, so people have speculated that maybe they were fallen angels, or perhaps even they were the original patriarchs that are listed there, because if you look at what Luke says about Jesus' genealogy, he takes Jesus' genealogy right back to Adam, and it says who was the Son of God?
Yeah.
Adam. So could it be that they were those first named patriarchs? We don't really know. But when it comes to the Nephilim, which the word actually means fallen ones, but sometimes translated giants, the Bible says something very intriguing. It says that there were these Nephilim, giants, in the earth in those days and also afterwards, which sounds like it's talking about after the flood. Now, how could you possibly have had them after the flood? And I mean, it's easy to see that if they were there before the flood, then they would have died in the floodwaters. But what about after the flood? Because we know from what the scripture says that only that one family survived the flood.
Yes.
Noah, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives. And we do see that there are reports of giant-type people after the flood. Okay, there's a guy who's mentioned called Abba, and not much is said about him, but he had a son called Anak, and the Anakim were supposedly giants who lived in the land of Canaan. And we read about Og, the king of Bashan, who had this enormous bedstead, so he was a giant as well. And when we get down to the time of David, we have Goliath and his brothers. So there were people of giant stature. And when you have a look at what line they came from in the Bible, it looks like they were all descendants of Ham. Now, how come they were giants if they were descendants of Ham, who was a son of Noah? And I know this is speculative, but I'm speculating that maybe the genetics for these people got through the flood in Ham's wife. Perhaps she was a descendant of some of these Nephilim. And it's very interesting too that this guy Abba, and not much is said about him, his name incorporates the name of Baal, which was one of the demonic gods. So whether there's a connection there or not, I don't know, because the Bible doesn't describe much about this guy Abba. So I can't really answer Dan's question about whether they're spirits of dead people, because the Bible is not specific about it. But certainly it's a very, very intriguing question.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen Hollywood sort of turn them into rock ants in the movie Noah. You saw those giant rock ants building stuff, and I mean, I think that was that was beyond speculation. That was sort of wild imagination almost in putting those together. But the bottom line is we don't know enough about it, and that's certainly one of those questions we can ask when we get there.
We can, Mick, and of course people need to realise if they saw the film Noah that it wasn't really based on the Bible. It was based on an occultish Jewish tradition called Kabbalah. So it wasn't based on the Bible at all. And people who went to see that movie thinking that they were going to see the story of Noah biblically, they were sadly mistaken.
Yes, a little bit off track. It's 13 minutes to 9, and we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, who's been answering your questions that you've sent through to 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. John, another question we had sent through to us, particularly after the conversation we've had over the last few weeks, and they were sort of questioning, the age of the Earth. Does it really matter if you think it's young or old?
Well, yes, and the question even went further than that and said, does it make any difference to your walk with the Lord, whether you believe the Earth is young or old? I think the issue on that really is how reliable we actually see the Bible. And our listener, John, last week and the week before had said that many people have got a very satisfactory spiritual life, not taking the Bible as spot on literal, historic and so on. And I don't think you can argue with that. There are plenty of people who don't take the Bible literally, who are very mature and satisfied Christians.
Of course they take a lot of it literally, just not all of it.
That's right. Now, my personal view is that taking the Bible exactly as it's written has been a great help to me. But I can't speak for everybody else, and there might be others who are just as comfortable taking it as parabolic as John suggested. So, really, it's not a salvation issue. We have to acknowledge that. Yeah. I just think that for me, it's been helpful.
Yeah.
But look, I wanted to mention another article that was in the news about the exploration of Mars, and currently, NASA have got a little guy called Perseverance rover on the way to Mars. He's about halfway there, and they're going to put him down, I think, in February, and he's going to run around like the earlier Mars rovers and try and find the best place for them to land the next thing that they're going to send up there, which is going to get a few Mars rocks. But that's a very, very tricky thing, and they've had to blow it out from 2026 to 2028 because it really is becoming very, very difficult.
Yes.
The little guy on the way there now is going to work out where the best place to start is. And, of course, what are they actually doing? Why do they want these Mars rocks? Well, they want to put a lander down somewhere where they think Mars has once had water, because they see that water is essential for life, which of course it is. But I mean, it's enormously expensive. The cost is blown out by a few more billion. And when you think of the cost that they had even getting a lander on the comet about 6 years ago, look, taxpayers are paying an awful lot of money for what the experts think that there might be life out there because there's water and so on.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of a great story that I heard in another context recently, and this had nothing to do with creation evolution, but it was a guy speaking about a personal experience that he'd had. He was an English fellow who was about 60 now, but he said that he grew up on the Isle of Wight, and when he was a young teenager, he and his brother were out exploring, and they came across an ancient graveyard. And there was one headstone there, and they were able to decipher the writing on it, and it turned out that it was the grave of a 90-year-old bloke who died back in the 1700s, so 200 years beforehand. Anyway, like all young blokes, they got digging around and pushing around, and they managed to dislodge the slab that was over the grave. And in the grave was a skeleton. And they thought, oh, hey, what's this, you know? And so they had the bright idea that they'd nick the skull and take it home and maybe put a light in it and, you know, have a lamp for the desk or whatever, you know.
Yeah, pretty.
Like young blokes will do. So they did, but they never got around to putting the light in it, and they decided a bit later on that they'd better get rid of the skull. So they chucked it away. And of course, what happened was that somebody had found it and took it to the police. So the police got all the forensic experts in to have a look at this skull. And the expert of experts determined that it was a 30-year-old man, not a 90-year-old, which the boys knew. It was a 30-year-old man, and that he died only 2 or 3 years beforehand from a bullet to the head. So now it became a murder investigation.
Oh, no.
Anyway, they decided it was time to fess up, so off they went to the police and said what the story was really, and the skull got returned to its rightful place. But it just goes to show you how we put such reliance on expert opinions, and very frequently the experts are just giving an opinion, but it's not something that you can really put too much store by. And that story reminded me of the old hoax that they called Piltdown Man back in the early 1900s, which was a fake skull. It was a combination of an orangutan skull and a human skull that had been stained to look old. And of course it was regarded as the missing link. And all of the anthropological experts examined this skull, and they were absolutely taken in by it for 40 years before the fraud was eventually exposed. So I think the moral of the story is be very, very careful when the experts give you an opinion that is contrary to the Bible. You know, the Bible is probably our guide for everything in the areas of faith. And I wouldn't be setting too much store by anything that I read where it contradicts the Bible.
Yes, so, I'm a bit concerned, Dr. John, that they're going to find life on Mars. I mean, I read a story last week, a science story that said they've actually had bacterium. This was in it was published in I guess it was a booklet called Microbiome, and they've actually got bacteria that they're sort of, you know, studying, but it's living outside the ISS, the International Space Station. So this bacteria is living literally out in space. And they've been studying this stuff for quite a long time. And I just read this story about some bacteria that's literally been living in space and still alive after 12 months. Now, if this stuff can live in space, surely all the little probes that we're sending to Mars right now has got some bacteria on it somewhere. And so one day they're going to find a piece and they'll go, look at this, we've found life on Mars. Is that not inevitable?
Look, one thing we do know, Mick, is that where there is any life, it was created. The problem with the explorations that we're seeing is that these people are evolutionists and they believe that life evolved, and that's why they fully expect to find some either on Mars or elsewhere in the universe, because they believe in evolution. But you're quite right. Even though there's a lot of sterilisation and great care measures taken to avoid putting any Earth bacteria out there in space, it's inevitable that some will get there at some stage in the future.
And they'll say it's different because even this stuff, once they sort of re-studied it under a microscope, it looked very different to the original. Still alive, still growing, but looked very different. And they say it was simply adapting to, well, obviously there's temperature and pressure and all sorts of other changes. And so, yeah, chances are they'll find something different, and it'll be big
look,
news.
Mick, I think supposedly things that look like they might have been bacteria have been found on meteorites, but when it's fully examined, it turns out not to be bacteria at all. So I think you take all of these things with a great grain of salt at the present time.
All righty. Well, Dr. John, thank you so much for another awesome week. And will you be here next Tuesday?
I'll be here again next week.
Excellent. Again, nowhere to go. And yes, we'd love some more questions sent through to us. If you can send your questions through to the text line 0401 949 949. Thank you, Dr. John. We'll see you again next week.
Thanks, Mick. And make sure the questions are texts, not trying to send voicemail, because we can't pick up voice, we can only pick up text.
Yes, 0401 949 949. You are on 94.9. Good morning.